Are the Twitter files nothing to see, or is the mainstream media ignoring real news? Today on Political Access, we're going to talk a little bit about this story, and I don't typically cover a lot of news, but this is related to politics, so let's jump right into it. I'll scroll through a couple of stories here from CNN as to why the mainstream media is pretty much ignoring this story. I'll scroll through the Wikipedia page, and I'll give you some of my thoughts on this. Well, prior to Elon Musk taking over Twitter, do I think there were some sort of problems related to censorship or speech suppression or chilling? Yeah, of course I do. I do think it was more so directed at people on the conservative side, but I also do hear there are some progressives that have been silenced, and that doesn't get covered enough as well. So I do agree. There's a little bit going on both sides, but I do so think it is more on the conservative side. There's plenty of times there's been account suspension, and it didn't really make a lot of sense. And then there's other times where there's been some horrible tweets from people around the world, and those haven't gotten the same treatment. So that's a problem. I think it's the lack of clarity and lack of consistency that's the driving force behind most of the outrage. It seems like it happens haphazardly, but I think that's a problem with anything in the world, where things are selectively enforced, and therefore they can be enforced in one direction or another. But here on Twitter, it's gotten so big, so popular. It's basically become ubiquitous, and I think it should mostly be treated like the First Amendment. Clear threats of violence, doxing, impersonation, libel. Those are some of the things that should not be allowed on there, and that makes sense. We wouldn't allow that pretty much anywhere. And then you get down to other things such as hate speech. Now, that's a nebulous term. I think everybody has their own definition. You get down to pornography and other types of subjectively distasteful speech. Now, those, I think, should be allowed, but there should definitely be a filter where you don't have to accidentally stumble across porn or a couple other categories that you personally find offensive. That's fine to me. Now, I get it. Of course, there's going to be times where there's going to be judgment calls, gray areas, and it's going to be hard to decide. But for the people that want to see it, let them see it. But I do think it can be a lot better than an inconsistent top-down approach. People should be able to choose the kind of content they want to see if it's not illegal. And then you can also get into the much, much more subjective category of misinformation, disinformation, and unpopular political opinions. Especially with the pandemic, there was a lot of stuff that was not settled, and some of it's still not settled at all either. And there should be a robust, open debate about that. There should not be anybody top-down saying, you cannot say this, or just labeling it as dangerous. I think that's a real problem. So there's all kinds of situations, including harassment. That's another thing to watch out for. Again, some of this is illegal and should not be allowed. Some of this should be filtered out from the bottom up, where you make your own decisions. And then there's going to have to be a lot of it that just stays there, and people look at it or don't look at it, and then we go from there. So I don't think it was like that. I think it was too haphazard, too closed off, too inconsistent, and the reputation became much more of an establishment liberal type of bastion, where they would try to scourge some progressives and a lot of conservatives that maybe pushed the envelope. So then when Elon Musk was going to take over, he sort of branded himself as the hero to free speech, and he was going to change the direction of the company, and that was welcome, especially by people on the right, people on the left. Most of them were skeptical or opposed it. So since he's taken over, it's still pretty early on. We got to see what happens over the next year or two. But a lot of people on the right approve of most of the changes, and the people on the left, they don't like the changes. So is he going to have his own biases and own problems in a different direction? Of course. So far, does it seem like he's moving in a better direction than it was, with transparency and a little bit more free speech? Yeah, it does. And I think this does showcase the kind of bias that was on there, where the more establishment liberal base, they had minimal problems before, and now they have a lot of problems because now some of their interests are threatened a little bit. And with that became the release of the Twitter files. I'm sure you've heard about that in the news. I've read a little bit about it, but I'm not going to go through all of it. But the gist of it is exposing a lot of internal decision-making, and that's a good thing. Donald Trump has been reinstated on Twitter. A lot of people don't like that. But to me, it's clear, all things considered, he should be allowed on there. But for me, I think the big takeaway so far is, why is most of the mainstream media, of course, except for a couple of right-leaning outlets like Fox News, why are they not only downplaying it, but a lot of them are just completely ignoring it? Now, all the lead up to Elon Musk taking over, and since he took over, I see countless news stories that indicate any kind of trouble for Musk, any bad decisions he's made, any former employees that have bad things to say. I've seen those over and over, where somehow he is the new villain in town and every story has to be negative. It does seem a little bit like Donald Trump to me. All the stories have to be covered in a way that's making him out to be the bad guy. You can't give him any good coverage. It's just very bizarre to me. There's no shortage of news covering this guy. But then when all these internal documents come out, it would put the company prior to Musk in a little bit of a negative light. Then all of a sudden there's minimal coverage. And to me that really exposes a lot of blatant media bias. And I think this is the problem. It happens, of course, on the right and the left. Most of the mainstream media, I do think, of course, leans left. I think a lot of people think that. And they can just choose what to cover and what not to cover. And that will dictate a lot of societal narratives. That's a serious problem, because if the mainstream media is going to tediously cover any story that makes Elon Musk or Twitter look like the bad guy now, but then completely ignore a lot of revelations about the past ownership, it's clear that there's going to be no trust in mainstream media. To overly cover things in one direction and then completely ignore them in another direction, or possibly rationalize as to why there's nothing to see here. I've seen a little bit of that too, when people are actually forced to comment on this. That's a major problem. And we do see this on the right as well. Donald Trump had a lot of criticism against him, and some of them were completely exaggerated or overblown or not true. Some of them were true. And people on the right would rationalize that indefinitely as well. But I think more of the so-called people in the middle, the mainstream media, they are controlling a lot of these narratives. And to not cover this story or any other stories that would damage their self-interest, which would generally be, again, that establishment Democratic viewpoint, such as the Hunter Biden laptop story, the Joe Biden, Tara Reade sexual assault allegations, and I'm sure the list goes on and on. Those are just the two big ones I thought of off the top of my head. And I think it's obvious to anybody that's not completely on one side that these stories would have been amplified if they happened against somebody on the right, especially Donald Trump. But when it's a story that goes after one of their own, then they retreat. They'll come up with any reason to discredit the person who brought the story. They'll just ignore the story if they can, or they'll convince themselves of some other reason why it's just not true or not to be looked at. Now, obviously, everything in these Twitter files is not going to be a big bombshell, but I think it is pretty pathetic and kind of startling when there's new ownership with a different ideology at the top. All of a sudden, all the people at the bottom shift their viewpoints, and now Twitter is supposed to be this bastion of hate and right-wing extremism, while the other side now views Musk as some free speech hero. I just don't like the all-or-nothing approach. I think the real focus should be on the corporate power, having that much control over our speech. And the other problem is, most people seem to have a negative opinion of billionaires in the abstract, but then when it comes down to their social or cultural politics, then there's the good or the bad billionaires, and they could use any of those issues to drive a wedge between us, so they can all get away with the same economic unfairness at the top, while we're down below arguing about the social and cultural issues. And one other thing I hear is, it's a private company, the First Amendment doesn't apply. Well, we heard that much more from people on the left when it was Jack Dorsey owning the company. It was supposed to be a private company, and they can do whatever they want, but now that it's Elon Musk, I've heard a lot of people change their tune on that and say, no, now they need government oversight, intervention. So again, there's a lot of hypocrisy here. And the last thing I'll say is there should not be any kind of tacit pressure or direct pressure from the state toward these companies on which kind of speech they're going to allow. Because when you can't separate out the state influence from the corporate decision-making, well then at that point, the corporation has become part of the state almost, and that's a significant problem. So I think it's a big mess. There's a lot of different dynamics at play here, but it's kind of expected with the media bias, with people rationalizing their different positions. We don't know what's going to happen next, but if there was this much going on behind the scenes at Twitter, I'm sure there's plenty more of this kind of stuff going on at other big tech companies, and they have a ton of control over our lives. There's privacy concerns, there's speech concerns, and I just wish it would be covered fairly in the media. But instead, it again exposes all the preconceived notions we had about bias, and most people are going to retreat back into their tribal camps, and it'll be more of the same societal downward spiral, where nobody can trust each other, we're all struggling to get by, while the people at the top have an inordinate amount of control over the economy and society. So anyway, that's some of my thoughts about the Twitter files and Elon Musk and of course media bias. Have you followed this story and what are your thoughts about any of the things I've mentioned? Let me know down below. And on your way out, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.